Why are there so many podcasts about Tottenham? Do I want to know why? They might contain insight, but mostly delusions. If I hear one more, I might die. They don't like Levy and they don't like Enoch. They pine for Moo and Conte. Someday we'll like 'em, old Tottenham Hotspur, the podcast clout chasers and me.
Hola, buenos dias. I don't know why I asked that like a question. Good day. Welcome to Tottenham Hotspur, the Tottenham Hotspur podcast about Tottenham Hotspur podcasts that this week is mixing it up by also being about Manchester United podcasts. Big game this week. If you're coming to this in the future, thank you. Like and subscribe. But this is the week of the Europa League final in Bilbao between the world's greatest football team, Tottenham Hotspur Football Club, and some bunch of jabronis called Manchester United Football Club. This week they both played some other games that no one really cared about. They both lost. Spurs lost to Villa. Manchester United lost to Chelsea. Spurs mostly rotated and put up a good fight from what I've heard. I didn't watch the game because, honestly, I think going into the final, having a completely clean slate and just remembering the good times is just putting me in a really healthy place to be pretty optimistic. And I can just focus on my biases. But United rolled out what I heard was a pretty strong 11 and still couldn't do the business against Chelsea, who, although they're in fourth or whatever, aren't any great shakes, let's be honest. Like I said, I didn't watch the Villa game. I kind of relied upon feedback on Blue Sky and also the Spurs Diehards Tottenham Till I Die recap that they had in their 2-hour live stream a couple of days ago. Kind of valued that. That was nice of them. Let's dig into it. I listened to some United pods this week. I wouldn't normally do this because it's hard enough keeping up to date with Tottenham Hotspur podcasts. I've started digging into the YouTube scene, and my God, there's even more there than I realized. That's going to take some work to figure out. And generally speaking, I also don't really have a policy of listening to people who hate me, whether that be on a personal level or how people are talking about Spurs. But I think this week it's an exception is going to be made. This is a big deal, and I want to know whether they're scared of us, whether they're taking us seriously, like how are they viewing their own progress in this competition versus their fuck-ups in the league. So I mostly have focused on pre-match week 37 podcasts from United. I found fewer podcasts in general than Spurs, especially fan podcasts, and this is kind of weird. I searched in Google, I searched in Apple, I searched in Spotify, I asked ChatGPT, and just the lists of podcasts that were coming out were pretty slim, or maybe it was a keyword problem, I don't know, but it did make me question whether or not they feel satisfied with the coverage they get generally in the media. Like you could say that the Gary Neville podcast is essentially a Manchester United podcast, right? They have multiple big podcasts from journalists, just as Spurs do. Like maybe they feel like their coverage is pretty robust, or maybe it's just a fan base difference. I don't know. There was a similar spread of podcasts, I'd say, to what we see with Spurs. Some Americans chiming in. There was a few Irish voices I picked up. Obviously very regionalised to Manchester and the north of England. But, some good stuff, I'd say, on the whole. Some similarities to Spurs pods. Right up front, if I was going to recommend anything for you to listen to this week, I would suggest that you sit down and listen to the Devil in the Details podcast, who spoke with Windy on the Extra Inch this week. I thought that they had a nice discussion from a sort of tactical standpoint. Obviously, these podcasters are coming at it from a partisan perspective, so you got to take match score predictions with a grain of salt. But I think that the narratives through which we're framing the game on Wednesday is kind of a big deal. So I'm just going to go through my list of podcasts, talk about them briefly, talk about what I liked about the United pods, and we'll see if we can learn something along the way. I did listen to some Spurs pods, and I'll talk about them afterwards. Grain of salt here, like I said, this may or may not be a true cross-section of United fan perspectives. These may not even be the best United podcasts. They came up again and again when I did searches on Reddit, to try to find what people were recommending to each other. Some of these podcasts get, tens of thousands of views on YouTube, so I think I did a pretty good job, but you never know. Maybe there was some stuff that I missed. So the first one I want to talk about is Alice Talks Football. This was recommended to me by a few folks on Blue Sky when I put out a call for United Pods a few weeks ago. I found this to be a good watch. I've seen some of her YouTubes before. I find it to be engaging and pretty thoughtful, which, as a thoughtful podcaster myself, I value that. Alice talked about how she was worried about having watched quite a lot of us this season, although she does think that United are slight favourites, mostly, and this is going to be a common theme, because they're United and they're trophy winners. And this is going to come up again and again. The history of Manchester United in this competition recently, I mean, they lost to Villarreal, but they won it, a few years ago under Mourinho, I think. They have a complex about themselves, and it's quite stark when you listen to Spurs podcasters talk about ourselves, and there's quite a lot of self-deprecation going on, versus United podcasters. The humour comes from very, very different places in these sets of pods. I wouldn't say Alice is a particularly funny podcaster or YouTuber, sorry Alice, but the others I listened to, and that was stuck in my brain while I was talking about it. It's funny though, she pointed to Spurs' physicality as being a problem, and how United don't score and are up against a good defence, which is something I agree with. But she does think that, United are the favourites, which is kind of odd. When you listen to the United podcasters talk, they say that they rate themselves and they think they're going to win, but then they start listing stuff, and there's very few pieces of evidence that point to them having a tactical or player edge over us. It's mostly based upon preconceived notions about who they are and what they are. Alice did talk about how Ange is hyping up his team, whereas Ruben Amorim, the Manchester United manager, is more focusing on the negatives of where they are in the league at the moment, and where they don't want to be where they are. It's kind of interesting that there's maybe very different vibes going in to the final in each camp, and we've heard in the press about how Manchester United aren't paying for their staff to go out to the game, whereas Tottenham Hotspur have offered to do so. And I forget who said it. I forget which podcast it was on. It might have been on Stretford Paddock, maybe somebody else. They were talking about how the sort of the vibe in the dressing room and the vibe in the training ground leading up to a final is almost as crucial as all of the other preparation that happens. Like the person at the front desk who greets you with a smile, who's cheering you on, versus, being kind of pissed off. And it's interesting that it doesn't sound like from the outside the United camp is a particularly wholesome place right now, but maybe I'm inferring way too much. Alice did point out that finals are about moments, and the games recently have been a lot closer than in sort of previous iterations of this fixture going back a couple years. So there are some reasons to think that maybe it won't be as smooth sailing as perhaps the League Cup game before Fraser Forster had a brain fart and let in 3 goals. But we'll see. I tuned into the Simply Red podcast. They were very wary about us, but again, they felt that their performances in the Europa League up to this point, coming back against Lyon, putting Athletic Club to the sword, have basically put their name on the trophy. That was their words, and they called it the biggest game post Fergie, which is massive when you think about it for a club like Manchester United. That was 10 years ago or more, 15 years ago Ferguson left, and this is their biggest game since then. Let's just hope that pressure gets to these players. All right, The Promised Land, another podcast. This one was entitled, What If United Don't Win the Europa? Which again, coming from this perspective of United fans thinking of themselves as amongst the elite, which, there's a lot of data to back that up. Their current position and their decline over the last couple of years maybe argues against that. But they are Manchester United. They're the club that I grew up with, who won the treble when I was like 13, So in my head, I kind of agree with them. They are an elite club. But the fact that they're even questioning, what does it mean for their club if they don't win the Europa is kind of huge to me. It suggests a chink in their armor, which is very cool from a Spurs fan perspective. Promised Land in general was quite an engaging listen. Reminded me a bit of Spurred On. Pretty humble, but there was a repeated focus on the importance of the Champions League and United getting back to where they belong. Spurs fans have been talking about this through the lens of the cup means more to Tottenham, the sort of bonus prize means more to Manchester United, and this was echoed in the United podcasts. That's definitely at the front of their minds, and I'll come back to that point in subsequent podcasts I talk about. American Red Devils, it is what it says on the tin. Think of it like Wheeler Dealer Radio. They contextualized the game and what a win would mean for Spurs and United via the lens of Arsenal, which was a very interesting third-party take on this whole thing. Even saying that they think that Arsenal hate United more than us and would want us to win more than them, which is insane when you think about it. There was some pushback from one of their colleagues on the pod, but again, it's this kind of arrogance that simmered through a lot of the United podcasts, how everything is about them. They are the center of the universe. And I found that kind of annoying, and it reminded me why I like Spurs fans so much. They also said on this pod, the American Red Devils, that if they can't beat us, they don't deserve the trophy. And, well, yeah, I mean, that's the way finals work. I don't want to cherry pick statements, but that kind of stood out to me. United We Stand said that they're due a win against us, which again, it's coming back to this lack of logic that's going on. It's not based upon like an analysis. Like Alice Talks Football was saying, they've got players for the moment. Just saying that you're due a win because we've won the last three, it doesn't really stand up to scrutiny, if you ask me. Spurs fans are saying something similar, but it's almost nervousness. It's trying to talk yourself out of confidence. This is different. All right, and I'm going to spend most of my time in the United section talking about the Stretford Paddock podcast, which I kind of enjoyed. Very similar to the Fighting Cock, I'd say. A bunch of middle-aged blokes telling mostly inappropriate jokes. I wouldn't say quite as... I'm going to pick my words carefully when talking about the Fighting Cock, but not quite as risque or as boundary pushing, or boundary breaking in many cases, unfortunately, as the Fighting Cock. But they were taking the piss out of us a lot. There's plenty there to be taking the piss out of, and quite honestly, if I was a United fan, that's probably what I'd want to be hearing right now, more than an analysis based upon everything else I heard. There's so much copium going on to justify why they'd win based upon, being due a win, or their name being on the trophy, all that type of stuff, that I think I would just prefer to listen to some blokes having a laugh and taking the piss out of Spurs for being Spursy. I mean, it's a phrase that I despise, but if I was another fan, I'd probably love it. They called Europa a second-rate competition, which again, there's that arrogance that I was talking about, and it would be a good time for fans, but the club really needs the Champions League, and I think that's just ridiculous. Like, I get that they're used to these finals, but the idea that the Europa is almost beneath them, it makes me want nothing more for them to be humiliated on Wednesday, because part of me wonders what would happen to United if they went into a bit of a tailspin, because their fans are kind of on the edge of accepting that they are bad right now, and that is where they are, rather than they shouldn't be here. They don't deserve to be this bad. Like it's almost like something that's been inflicted upon them rather than something which has come from within through poor recruitment, etc. But yeah, there was lots of jokes in there. They talked about how Spurs haven't got any pedigree, and in fact, like, they couldn't even spell the word pedigree. I think they said that we hadn't won anything ever, that Casemiro's won more than the entire club as a whole. It was just kind of ridiculous. There was some stuff I did enjoy about how they talked about it, because you wouldn't hear this type of stuff on a Spurs podcast, and it was coming from the perspective of what a manager's role is in a final. They've had some of the most winningest, there you go, there's an Americanism for you, the most winningest managers in Premier League history take them to success. Alex Ferguson obviously stands out, but even Jose Mourinho won things with them. They've seen big managers come in and do well. So I think through their understanding of the behaviors and approaches of those managers, they've learned something that we can listen to and kind of grok. So they were thinking about how a manager's role in the final is not so much about tactics as it is about being a cheerleader for their players. Calming down and identifying guys who need to be calmed down to get them to perform, or sort of giving a rocket up the arse or geeing up other players. And I think that's kind of interesting. They referenced something that Alex Ferguson said in the past, which was that you only need 8 players to play well in a final to win it, which is not something I'd ever heard of before. But going through the Spurs squad, I think I can identify at least 5 off the bat who I think are going to have a good game, and that's the defence and Vicario. So that leaves us with just 3 outfielders. If you throw in Solanke, I think he's going to have a good game. I think Sonny's going to have a good game if he starts. And then we just need one other person to have a good game. They did talk about the role of legacy players, like Bobby Charlton, who in the past apparently has sat down with their guys ahead of finals to just kind of play into the, we're United standpoint. We win things, you're part of the history now. And they kind of insultingly questioned who Spurs could have in that dressing room, such as like Yunus Kabul, who could inspire the players to trophies. And I don't know. I think you could probably rustle somebody up, but there's some harsh truths in there. But yeah, just generally speaking, they echoed and emphasized how this is about the Champions League. It isn't about the cup. The cup is a nice, little trophy that they'll add to their collection. But it's about getting back up into the elite and back where they feel that they belong. And that's kind of sad in a way. It's almost like the devaluing of the League Cup, where it's seen as a third-rate competition. This is the UEFA Cup. It's got a really, really proud pedigree. Many football fans would chew their arm off to win the UEFA Cup. And here at Manchester United, kind of treating it almost like something they deserve. So, kind of interesting stuff. In summary, they're basing up their chances of winning on their moments players and their mentality. There's an arrogance about them, which is somewhat earned. But generally speaking, I'd say they're scared. I think they're really scared of us, and they're really scared of being the team that lets Tottenham finally win a trophy for the first time in, 15 years. They've been there before, and they've stopped us winning trophies. The 2009 League Cup final springs to mind for me. And I hope that we can inflict that upon them. And this kind of nervousness was confirmed by Ian Irving, who's from the Athletics Talk of the Devils podcast. He appeared on An Echo of Glory. He actually thought, again, like I said before, that they'd win via a moments player, Ahmad off the bench. So, that's another thing just to highlight, is that generally speaking, these podcasts are going to back themselves, right? They're going to back their team. There was one guy on the Stretford Paddock podcast, the sort of fighting cock-alike, who really thinks that they're going to lose. And that was the only person, maybe there was a couple others on the United side, who were pretty on the fence about whether they could get the job done. But he was the most explicit, who said that they thought that their team wouldn't win. And all of the Spurs podcasters I've heard, they've said it might be tight. They've said it could go to extra time. Pretty much all of them have said they think that we'll be United. And I think that's a stark contrast where these fans are right now. So moving on to the Spurs pods. There's lots of Ange Postecoglou talk, and I can't believe we're debating this in the week before a final, whether or not he's still going to have a job in a week. It's tiresome. I don't think it's particularly helpful. Speaking of Ange, there was some comments in the United pods, just quickly to loop back to them, about how they thought there was some narrative going on and some vibes coming from his statement about how he always wins things in the second season. And I thought that was kind of cool, how something from months ago has kind of scared that fan base, that he might have something up his sleeve. So maybe we should remember that. But yeah, the Spurs podcasters, and kind of the same way that United are taking the trophy kind of for granted and that they deserve it, Spurs podcasters have been taking Ange Postecoglou's position at our club for granted. And that we really are not indebted to him in any way in this route to the final, I feel. Jack from Roost thinks we'll beat United. Come and Discuss Spurs thinks it's going to be unanimous win, but could involve extra time. It's going to be tight. So Spurs, in their Bilbao preview, thought it was going to be a win, but again, needs to be wrapped up in 90 minutes because the United players have shown that they can show up in big games. Caught a bit of Irish Hotspur for the first time, the back end of their Aston Villa watch-along on YouTube. Jack Kinnicky on that show talked about how, or wondered, I should say, whether it's more important to win trophies or to get Champions League in terms of how messages should be signaled to potential new managers. And this is kind of a strange question to worry about at this point. You kind of take what you can get in the moment. And this is in terms of how Ange was kept on, I think. If we really valued getting into the Champions League, he would have been sacked months ago, maybe. I listened to Durag Diaries for the first time on YouTube. They've got a lot of content. Sometimes they have way too many people on the show, but I enjoyed the combined 11 that they made with Saeed TV from Manchester United, Ash from Football Kings, a bloke from Football Heritage TV too. The Spurs fans were leaning 2-1 or a sloppy game plus penalties. Saeed, the United fan, thought it was going to be 3-1 to United. I mean, again, I think he was the only person on that stream who was a United fan, so I think had to be confident. Checked out Nige, Pure COYS. Very confident we can beat United. I quite enjoyed his content, if I'm honest. It was quite... it was nice. I liked the way that he was calling for fan base unity. But Nige pointed out that, we've never really won a lot of trophies on a decade-by-decade basis for a long time, and was hoping that perhaps this could kickstart something. So that's kind of nice. I like the positive vibes coming out of that. The Chris Cowlin stream, Craig on there, was hoping that we do turn up because we can. If we can do that, we can beat them. But United players are players who can conjure magic. Chris himself didn't think the United were still arrogant about the lads it's Tottenham type of stuff, which is hilarious because I think in every single podcast I heard, there was a mention to lads it's Tottenham, Spursiness, the Spurs gene or something, which is, definitely at the forefront of their minds. And there was a lot of talk about how there's fretting and dreaming from Spurs fans at the moment. And I totally identify with that. My every waking moment, I think, is spent thinking about this fucking game on Wednesday. Tuned into Hollie's Hotspurs, plus a few others, were comparing Son to Kane returning in 2019. So Harry Kane was injured for months in the lead up to the Champions League final. Son is our best player. He's been injured, hasn't really been playing. But Crackers, who was on that stream, I guess on loan from Last Word on Spurs, didn't feel like this was necessarily true. Son's got a few more minutes underneath his belt, and maybe the difference between Son and the players in his positions in terms of performances are not quite as great as Kane in 2019. Lucas scored a hat-trick, so Kane was kicking out a player from the team who was in great form. Tottenham Depot feels like it's time to lift a trophy. Anxious, talking of the times of destiny. Fighting Cock were confident. More talk of it being our time and what it might mean if we win. And last word on Spurs were worried about the big name players, and they were confident. So Spurs pods, in summary, were pretty confident about our chances. They thought it was going to be tight for the most part, feeling like we need to get a few goals to win the game to see United off. Hoping to just get something for good vibes. Not so worried about Champions League, or at the very least were actively pushing back against it because of what they perceived the United fan base wanted out of this final. I maybe thought there was perhaps some distancing from the churlishness that, the prize is more important than the trophy. But yeah, I have to agree with that. I think that we're in a good place. I think that we've won a number of games against them. That if our best players show up, we beat them. I think that if the game is controlled, as we've shown ourselves to be capable of with our first choice 11 for the most part, or at least the sort of first choice backline, I think we can win this game. But if it gets a little chaotic, then Bruno or Ahmad or one of their players can perhaps get the yards they need to pull off a piece of magic that will change the game. And that worries me. So I actually think our route to success is if we can keep it controlled and keep it tight, we win it. I wouldn't call it comfortably, but I think we can win the game. As soon as it becomes a bit of a slugfest, I think we're kind of boned. So I'm hoping that doesn't happen. Hoping for a very boring 2-1 win to Spurs on Wednesday, followed by a very exciting trophy parade on Friday. Before I wrap up, I do want to talk briefly about what's happening with N17 women. I've been listening to their pod all year. I set myself a goal of trying to track Spurs women a lot more this year, even before I started the podcast. And N17 women have been a really important part of my journey to appreciating the women's team a lot more. So the Women's Super League wrapped up last weekend. Spurs managed to eke out a draw, fortunately, in their last game, but they have no wins since January. There's a lot of similarities to the men's team, manager woes, loss after loss, a few key injuries, all without a cup run, and they might even finish in the same position as we will, which is one spot above relegation. So check out N17 Women if you've got time this week. I know that there's a lot going on with the men's team, but try to carve out some space if you can. They did a really good squad review, and looking ahead to what might be on the cards next season, especially managerial changes, WSL changes, and a nice little partner to the N17 Women podcast was Sunday's Tottenham Depot, when a question about who the next Spurs women's coach might be was thrown out, and there was a really thought-provoking suggestion for a member of the Spurs men's staff who could potentially take the reins on the women's team. So check that out if you've got time. All right, so let's just wrap everything up. Man United versus Spurs. Big game on Wednesday. United fans don't really seem to be capable of enjoying the game from what I picked up without, having a trophy. Like, it's funny how Spurs fans are much more capable of just kind of making their own fun, probably because we've had to over the years. And United fans, in their podcasts, a lot of the jokes and humour seems to derive from other fans' misery, whereas Spurs fans, it's a lot more kind of self-deprecating, poking fun at ourselves. I think we're a lot more self-aware. United are basing their chances of a win on their history. Spurs, it's more about the performances that we've been putting in and our desire to win, which is really interesting. I think it's funny how people talk about recent history as if there's a guarantee of it repeating. For example, there was a lot of talk in these podcasts, especially on the Spurs side, about how we got to get rid of Ange, because look at United with what happened with Erik ten Hag in the FA Cup last year, as if it's guaranteed that we're going to win the Europa League, keep Ange, and then we're going to be up shit creek in a few months. But there's an inconsistent application of this type of logic. From my perspective, I think Manchester United's run to the Europa League final this year is very similar to our 2019 Champions League final. You know, if you look at their run, there's the amazing comebacks against Lyon, you know. There's a lot of echoes of what we did against Ajax and City. Whereas we're coming into it in the much more controlled, composed team. Much like Liverpool were, I would say, for the most part. In that final in 2019, they really, due to, some extenuating circumstances and a Musa Sissoko handball, but they had control. They kept us at arm's length. And I really think that if Mickey van der Ven, Christian Romero turn up and can just absolutely boss that Man United front line, will be good. So talking about the Champions League spot as a goal versus the trophy as the goal, which is the Manchester United and Spurs viewpoints, I think this all comes to different types of validation. United want the validation that they are back among the elite. I think it's maybe a little bit more internal, that validation they're seeking. They're trying to confirm amongst themselves that how they feel is correct. And yes, that's from an external source, but I don't think many people are really questioning whether Manchester United are a big side. Whereas for Spurs, I think the validation they'd get from lifting a trophy is much more external, at least what they're seeking. They're seeking the Warra trophy, the empty trophy cabinet jokes to go away. They want to be seen as a side that can get it done and win a trophy when they need to. So, unlike other finals that we've seen, like in the FA Cup this week, Crystal Palace were just there. I don't think they were looking for validation. They weren't looking for anything like that. They were just looking to win, the pure joy of winning a trophy. Whereas there's a lot more on the line for both United and Spurs this week. And I hope that we're the ones who gets what they need. Well, this has been a bit of a rambly podcast. I'm sorry. This was quite a big deal for me to try to cover this type of stuff. But I had a good time. I learned a lot. I spent a lot of time thinking about Manchester United and realised that my mum, a Man United fan, is probably the best Manchester United fan out there because the other ones are all bastards. Whereas my mum is lovely. So that was something that I learned. And now I've told you. I think we're going to do it. And I think that you should like and subscribe. Tottenham Hotspur. Follow me on Blue Sky. And have a good time. See you in a couple weeks. Or in a week or whatever. And hopefully we'll have a trophy. Cheers.